Let's review what we've done so far. We made papier-mâché landforms, 2 mountains in a tiny mountain range. Then we placed the mountain range underneath the plastic grid. We took careful measurements, measuring the distance between the grid and the landform. We made sure to measure exactly where that piece of spaghetti was hitting the landform. We marked the spaghetti with a pencil and then measured it against the ruler, rounding to the nearest whole centimeter. We recorded that information on our first grid. Then we had to do some subtraction. We subtracted every measurement that we took from the highest elevation. This way, we would know the elevation of that tiny mountain range at each point on the grid. First, take each of those numbers that you found by subtraction and write them very carefully in their spot. So the number that you found for A1, write it very carefully on A1 on the other grid that you made. Now remember, each point on your graph paper grid shows the elevation of the mountain range at that point. And now we're going to look for changes in the elevation as we move across the graph paper grid and down the graph paper grid. Starting at the top of your paper, look for changes in elevation. Here I don't see any change. I go from 0 to 0. Or sometimes I go from 0 to 1. That shows that there was an increase in 1 centimeter between point E and F. Between point G and H, another 1 centimeter. But between H and I decrease, I go down by 2 centimeters. So I'm adding a dot in the middle to show that I had a decrease of 2 centimeters. Here's another point where I'm going to add a 2 to show that between that 1 centimeter elevation and that 3 centimeter elevation, there would have been 2 centimeters. You're going to do this for the whole paper. In some places, you're going to add a lot of dots because you're increasing your elevation from, say, 2 to 6. Wherever you have a lot of dots, that simply means that your mountain range went up in elevation in a smaller amount of space. When you only have maybe 1 dot between your points, that means there wasn't as big of an increase in elevation between those 2 points. The more dots you have, the more your elevation changed between those 2 points on your grid. Go along your paper adding those numbers up, adding them in. And then go down as well. Remember, wherever you have a lot of dots, that simply means that your elevation changed a lot between those 2 points on your grid. And where you don't have many dots, that means your elevation did not change as much. You can make the dots evenly spaced between the 2 official points on your grid. When you're done, your paper is going to look like this. You're going to have some places where there are lots of dots between the points on your grid, and you're going to have other places where there aren't as many. Remember, wherever you have more dots, it simply means that your elevation changed a lot between those 2 points. Now comes the fun part. On a topographic map, a contour line connects the points of equal elevation. So now you're going to connect any of those points that have the same number. That means they had the same elevation. So here you see me connecting any of the points that have a number 2. And that means that those were all places that had the same elevation, an elevation of 2 centimeters. Now contour lines must never cross each other. So be very careful when you're doing this that you haven't made a mistake in putting your dots on your paper. You'll know you haven't made a mistake when your contour lines never overlap. You'll start to notice that there are places where your contour lines are very close together. And that means that that was a place where you had a change of elevation that happened in a small space. When you're all done, you can hold this contour map that you've created up to your actual papier-mâché mountain range and see how close it is in appearance to your mountain range. This is what mine looked like when I was all done. When I was sure it was perfect, I went over my lines with a brown marker. Our contour interval is 1 centimeter. That means that every line that you see shows a change in elevation of 1 centimeter. But I also put an index contour on my contour map. You're going to see that there are 2 lines that are darker, and one is labeled 5 and the other is labeled 10. And these are index contours, which help us because they're labeled, and it's usually a heavier line than the regular contour lines. I also started adding color to my contour map, and I erased any of the marks from my earlier work. Green typically represents woods, and blue represents water. The thin blue line is a stream, and the thicker blue space at the bottom is a lake.